Fog lay thick over the beet fields near Arracourt in the French region of Lorraine. It was the morning of September 19th, 1944. A cold drizzle drifted down. Visibility fell to barely 30 feet. Somewhere out in that gray wall, heavy engines were turning over, and no American on the low ground could say exactly where. Sergeant Stacy rode in the lead vehicle. It was a squat machine with an open top, grinding forward towards a rise the maps marked as Hill 279. For a single second, the fog thinned. A long gun barrel was poking out of the murk ahead. It belonged to a German tank, and it sat less than 30 feet away. Stacy fired first. His opening shell struck home, and the enemy tank burst into flame. The fire lit up shapes behind it. More tanks waiting in the mist. His next round killed a second. Moments later, his own vehicle took a hit in the flank and was knocked out. When the shooting stopped, 5 German tanks were burning. The Americans had lost one machine. The whole exchange had lasted minutes. The vehicle that did this was meant to be a coffin. Its armor in places was thinner than 5 millimeters. Its turret had no roof at all. Senior officers had questioned whether so fragile a thing could ever face a Panther and survive. They were wrong. This is the story of how a tank destroyer that everyone called useless tore apart some of Germany's newest Panzers at Arracourt. To see why the M18 was such an odd machine, you have to start with the fear that created it. In the spring of 1940, German armor had ripped through France in 6 weeks. Massed tanks punched holes in the line and ran wild in the rear areas. Watching from across the Atlantic, the United States Army decided it needed a precise answer to that precise disaster. The answer arrived as a doctrine. The Army called it Seek, Strike, Destroy. The idea, shaped by General Leslie McNair, ran along these lines. Ordinary tanks should not be wasted dueling enemy armor. Instead, special units would sprint to the site of a breakthrough and smash the attacking tanks with speed and firepower. These units were the tank destroyers, and they would be fast. They would hit hard, and to buy that speed, they would carry almost no armor. History has been harsh on that idea, and with good reason. A study by the Combat Studies Institute, written by Christopher Gable, judged the whole concept aggressive on paper but seriously flawed in practice. The Germans rarely obliged by attacking in the neat, massed waves the doctrine expected. Field commanders kept using the destroyers for jobs the manual never described, towing them, digging them in, firing them like makeshift artillery. By the end of the war, the entire notion of a separate tank destroyer branch was being quietly buried. Behind the doctrine sat a whole organization. The Army built a dedicated tank destroyer command with its own training center, its own aggressive creed, and its own badge of a big cat crushing a tank in its jaws. Some battalions were handed towed anti-tank guns. Others, the fortunate ones, received self-propelled machines like the M18. The towed units struggled badly in the field. The self-propelled crews, mobile and quick, fared far better. The Hellcat was the sharpest expression of that self-propelled idea. Speed is armor. Aggression is doctrine. It was a gamble baked into steel. Now place that troubled idea in Lorraine in September of 1944. General George Patton's Third Army had raced clean across France. It had forced a crossing of the Moselle River near the city of Nancy, but the tanks were running dry. Fuel was rationed to a trickle. The great advance had slowed to a crawl, and the German command spotted its chance. It is worth pausing on how strange the moment was. Only weeks earlier, the Germans had been in headlong retreat across France. Now, on the very border of the Reich, they had scraped together enough new armor for one hard punch. Hitler wanted far more than a local spoiling attack. He dreamed of cutting off Patton's leading formations, throwing the Americans back over the Moselle, and buying time in the West. The plan asked Green Brigades to do the work of veterans. It was a bet placed by a high command running out of good cards. The task landed on the 5th Panzer Army, led by General Hasso von Manteuffel. He was clever, aggressive, and vastly experienced. His instrument was a pair of brand new Panzer brigades, the 111th and the 113th. They were stiffened by parts of the 11th Panzer Division and the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. Their orders were bold: retake the town of Lunéville, crush the American bridgehead on the Moselle, drive on, and seize Nancy. On paper, the force looked lethal. The Germans committed 182 tanks. 107 of them were Panthers. Another 75 were Panzer IVs. Add 80 assault guns and the total climbed to 262 armored vehicles. There was rot hidden inside that strength, though. The 113th Panzer Brigade had only been formed on September 4th. Its crews had trained for roughly 2 weeks. Many of them could not read a map. Fuel shortages had gutted their practice time down to almost nothing. They rolled to battle with powerful tanks and only the faintest idea of how to fight together. Waiting for them around Arracourt stood Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division. It was led by Colonel Bruce Clark. His force was small and stretched dangerously thin. He held the 37th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Patton Abrams. That was a name destined to end up stamped on a future American main battle tank. He had a battalion of armored infantry. He had engineers. He had 3 battalions of artillery. And crucially, he had a company of tank destroyers, drawn from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. Those crews and their strange machines were about to write themselves into the record for good. So, what exactly was this weapon so many people doubted? The full designation was the 76mm gun motor carriage, M18. Everyone knew it by its nickname, the Hellcat. It was built by Buick, the car division of General Motors. Between July 1943 and October 1944, 2,507 of them rolled off the line. Each one cost the Army about $55,230. Begin with the figure that made it famous, speed. On a good road, the Hellcat could reach 55 miles per hour. That is 89 kilometers per hour. It was the fastest tracked armored vehicle of the entire Second World War. It held that record for decades, right up until the M1 Abrams arrived long after the war had ended. A Continental radial aircraft engine of about 350 horsepower drove it forward. A Torque-Matix automatic gearbox let the driver change gear without wrestling the machine through the mud. A torsion bar suspension kept the ride steady at speed. For a vehicle of roughly 15 tons, it moved like a racing car. Now the bill for that speed, armor. The plating on the M18 ran from just under 5 millimeters at its thinnest to about 25 millimeters at its very thickest. In plain terms, parts of that hull would not reliably stop a heavy machine gun. Worse still, the turret was open to the sky. There was no roof over the men inside. A shell bursting in the trees above them could rain splinters straight down. A grenade could be lobbed in. Rain and snow simply fell on the crew. 5 men rode in each one, a commander, a gunner, a loader, a driver, and an assistant driver. Between them, they stowed 45 rounds for the main gun. The whole machine stood only about 8 feet 5 inches tall. It was low enough to vanish behind a hedge or a fold in the ground, and that low shape would matter enormously. The open turret was not simply a flaw, it was a choice, and the crews felt both sides of it. With no roof, a commander could stand tall and see. He could hear. He could catch the flash of a distant gun or the cough of an engine somewhere in the trees. In a war fought so often by ambush, seeing first was living. The same open top that let splinters fall in also let the crew fight their machine with their heads up and their eyes everywhere. It was a brutal trade. Better awareness bought with terrible vulnerability. The main gun was the M1, a 76mm weapon. For its size, it was a genuinely fine gun. It fired a fast, flat shell that dealt with most German armor cleanly at sensible range. Against the thick, sloped front of a Panther, though, it hit a wall. Standard armor-piercing shot could not punch through a Panther's glacis plate head-on at normal fighting distance. There was a special round with a tungsten core that could crack the Panther's gun mantlet out to about 1,000 yards, but it was rare. A crew might see only a handful of those precious rounds in a whole month of combat. The gun itself tells a small story about the whole American war. For a long time, the Army had been slow to admit that its tanks and destroyers needed heavier weapons. Commanders fretted about upsetting production and training. When the shock of heavier German armor finally forced the issue, the 76mm was the gun that answered. On the Hellcat, it was married to a light, fast hull. The combination made a hunter, not a brawler. A hunter built to stalk and to strike from the edges. There was another quiet virtue the specification sheets rarely captured. The Hellcat was reliable. Its automatic transmission and its radial engine engine, for all their quirks, kept the machine running when heavier vehicles broke down. A tank destroyer that arrives is worth far more than a stronger one stranded with a thrown track. In a battle decided by who could turn up again and again, in the right place at the right minute, reliability was its own kind of firepower. Here then was the bargain the designers had struck, laid bare. They bought blazing speed by throwing the armor away. The entire plan for staying alive rested on a single rule: never let the enemy line up a clean shot. Move, fire, and disappear before the reply arrived. On open ground against a dug-in Panther with a long-range gun, that plan could kill a crew in seconds. In the right conditions, on the right ground, it could win an entire battle. Quick pause before the guns open up. If this is landing for you, a subscribe genuinely helps the channel. Now, to the battle. The morning of September 19th broke in dense fog, and that fog decided everything that followed. It grounded the aircraft both armies leaned on. Far more importantly, it canceled the German advantage. A Panther gun could kill across a wide open field at extreme range. In thick fog, you could not even see a target until it was a few hundred yards away, and very often much closer than that. The battle was going to be fought at knife range, and at knife range, the Hellcat's speed and low body counted for far more than the thickness of a Panther's front plate. At about 0730 hours, the alarm ran through Combat Command A. Captain William Dwight, a liaison officer from the 37th Tank Battalion, hurried to rouse a platoon of tank destroyers. Colonel Clark himself gave the order to push them forward to Hill 279 as an outpost. Lieutenant Leiper led them out. He rode at the head of his platoon in a jeep so that he could direct all 5 destroyers together rather than fight blind from inside just one of them. That was the platoon Sergeant Stacy was leading when the German barrel loomed out of the trees. 5 enemy tanks died in that first clash on the hill. Through the rest of that gray dripping day, the same platoon kept swinging from position to position. It picked off Panzer IVs crawling along a distant ridgeline. It caught tanks that had tried to slip around behind the high ground. Vehicles were lost, crews were hit, and still the guns kept firing. By nightfall, the tally was astonishing. Captain Leach, who commanded a company in the 37th Tank Battalion, said the whole combat command was amazed at the stand that platoon had made. He confirmed the number. That single platoon of tank destroyers was credited with 15 German tanks in one day. They were not the only Americans bleeding the enemy. In a separate clash that same foggy morning, Captain Dwight took 4 tank destroyers down into a low hollow to meet a German thrust. 3 of his 4 machines were knocked out, but before they died, those crews destroyed 7 German tanks. Everywhere across the sector, the pattern repeated itself. When Panthers pushed towards Clark's own headquarters, the gunners of the field artillery dropped the barrels of their heavy howitzers level. They fired straight down the line of sight at ranges of barely 200 yards. Abrams slid his Shermans through the fog and struck the Panzers in the flank, where the steel was thin. German scouting was weak and clumsy, and it kept driving the attackers blind onto concealed American guns. Look closely at why it worked, and the same threads keep appearing. The ground around Arracourt was a gently rolling plateau, cut by shallow valleys and scattered with small villages. In clear weather, it was killing country for a long-ranged gun. In fog, it became a maze, and a maze favored the crew that knew the land and moved fast through it. The green German crews did neither well. They bunched up. They lost direction. They drove past hidden destroyers without ever seeing them and paid for it with their flanks. The Americans, fighting on ground they had already scouted, simply waited for the shapes to appear and fired. Much of the credit belongs to the man who kept his nerve. Colonel Bruce Clark had decided he would not sit still and be pounded. He would meet each German thrust by moving to strike its flank, trading a little ground for a killing angle. It was exactly the kind of fast, aggressive defense the Hellcat was made for. Under a more timid commander, the same machines and the same men might have been picked apart. Under Clark, they were turned into a scalpel. The official United States Army history is precise about the result of that first day. On September 19th, Combat Command A reported 43 German tanks destroyed. Most of them were factory-fresh Panthers. The American cost came to 6 men killed and 13 wounded, with 3 tank destroyers and 5 Shermans knocked out. The 113th Panzer Brigade, so fearsome on paper only a fortnight earlier, had been gutted in a single afternoon. The fighting did not stop there. It ground on for days. On the 20th of September, September, German tanks slipped back into the village of Arracourt itself and had to be hunted down among the houses. On the 22nd, the tank destroyers rolled out yet again and broke up another armored thrust, killing 7 more tanks in the process. Manteuffel would not give up quickly. He fed in fresh forces and probed for a soft spot, shifting his attacks north and south of the town, hunting for open ground where his Panthers could fight at the range they preferred. He never found it in time. The weather kept closing back in. The American artillery, superbly handled, broke up attack after attack before the Panzers could close, and the destroyers and Shermans kept appearing out of the gray at the worst possible moment for the men in the German turrets. By the last days of September, the offensive was spent. On the 29th, the fighting around Arracourt guttered out, and Manteuffel's shattered brigades pulled back. Do not imagine any of this was clean or easy for the men who lived it. The battle swung back and forth over the same villages and ridges for the best part of 2 weeks. Crews went without sleep. Machines that survived a morning were burning by the afternoon. For every tidy figure in the record, there was a wrecked hull with men trying to climb out of it on both sides. The Hellcat crews won, but they won the hard way by turning out again and again into the same lethal fog. By the time the whole affair had run its course, the numbers told the entire story. Of the 262 armored vehicles the Germans threw into the fighting around Arracourt, 86 were destroyed outright. 114 more were damaged or simply broke down and were abandoned. Only 62 were still running by the end of the month. Combat Command A, the unit that soaked up the heaviest blows, lost 25 tanks and 7 tank destroyers across the entire battle. The great counterattack meant to recapture Nancy had smashed itself to pieces instead. Within days, Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army was down to roughly 25 Panthers still able to move, and it was Patton, not the Germans, who had held the field. News of the fight traveled fast. In a war where American armor was so often told it was outmatched by German steel, Arracourt was proof of something the crews already suspected. The machine mattered less than how you used it. The battle became a case study, taught for years afterwards, in how mobility, gunnery, air power, and ground could beat raw armored superiority. For the men of the 704th, though, it was simpler than any lesson. They had been handed a machine the experts pitied, and they had used it to win. Now let us be fair to the enemy, because the Panther has earned that fairness. In cold engineering terms, the Panzer V Panther was a far better tank than the Hellcat. It was a better tank than the Sherman, too. Its front glacis was 80 millimeters of steel, steeply angled, which made it behave like close to 140 millimeters of solid plate against an incoming shell. Its long 75 millimeter gun was superb. It hurled a shell out at about 935 meters per second, fast enough and flat enough to kill an American vehicle across a field before that vehicle could even reply. The Panther weighed around 45 tons. It carried a proper armored roof over its crew, gun for gun and plate for plate. On open ground, it should have won. The Hellcat could not match a single one of those figures. What it could do was punish everything the Panther did badly. The Panther's turret turned slowly. American reports noted that a Sherman or a Hellcat could pump 4 or 5 rounds into a Panther's flank in the time it took that heavy German turret to grind around and bear. A full circle of the turret took the Panther the better part of 15 seconds. Add the fog to that weakness. Add the Hellcat's speed. Add its low body, dropping out of sight behind every rise. The whole balance tipped. The Hellcat did not beat the Panther by being stronger or better protected. It beat the Panther by refusing at every turn to fight the kind of battle the Panther was built to win. It is worth setting the Hellcat beside its own cousins as well, because the American tank destroyer came in more than one shape. The M10, which the British called the Wolverine, was the earlier design. It was slower and built on a Sherman hull, but it carried noticeably thicker armor than the Hellcat. Later came the M36, the Jackson. That was the one American destroyer mounting a 90mm gun heavy enough to kill a Panther from the front with real confidence. Set against those two, the M18 was the sprinter of the family. It was the least protected. It was by far the fastest. And in the hands of crews who truly grasped what it was for, it was lethal. The Sherman, the workhorse that fought alongside it, was outgunned.